Well, I used to think that people disagreed on big topics, and then I realized that that was way too generous, and that people disagree on everything. Hey, friends, my name is Bob Turner. I'm the library director at Harding School of Theology. And today I want to dig into something that just really concerns me that I think about a lot, which is that we seem to have a capacity to disagree with everybody about everything. And I don't really know how there's any way forward for us as the people of God or as a church or even in any of our workplaces and neighborhoods if we have a model of going through life believing that there are two teams, there's us and them, and that if you're part of them, then I just can't have a conversation with you without screaming or without dismissing you as being ignorant and inconsiderate of anything that I care about. We got to get past this. I started thinking about this pretty critically a few years ago when I came across one of the best books I'd ever read on this topic, and that's Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. In that book, Jonathan Haidt goes in and says, is there something within the way that we fundamentally think relative to our brain and that gives us sort of different ways of having a hard time conversing with other people who might disagree? Here's what Haidt says. There's 6 basic values that all of us hold. When it's basic values, what it means is like there's 6 major concerns that tug on us as people, but all of us don't have all 6 of those in equal proportion. Here's what the 6 are. There's care versus harm, liberty versus oppression, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation. I know, sounds like a lot here. Here's what he says is going on. If you really disagree with somebody, it isn't that they're totally wrong and you're totally right. What it is that of those 6 values that I just mentioned, one of you holds some of those values higher and one of you holds some of those values lower. Now, before we get smug and think, well, I'm really big on all 6 of those, that can't be true. None of us can hold all 6 at 100% all the time. But somebody we're talking to might hold one of them at 100%, and that's when we begin disagreeing. Now, Haidt hit the scene with this book. He did really well, and eventually he published an article in The Atlantic that was, he wrote, it was about how people who are in Generation Z or younger millennials seem to be getting depressed more than ever before and seem to be very unhappy with their life, even though their life might look really good. And he published an article, and they called it The Coddling of the American Mind. Well, that article wasn't exactly as bad as the title made it out to be, but the article was wildly well received. And so he ended up publishing the fantastic book called The Coddling of the American Mind. Him and Greg Lukianoff talked about how it is that there seems to be a ton of social unrest that is often being instigated by the people who seemingly would have the most privileged lives, namely college students at really, really expensive colleges who come from really, really flush families. Why is it that they can be so unhappy? Again, in that book, he gets into the idea that oftentimes the things that we value are not valued by others, and that just makes basic conversation impossible. Followed that up, Jonathan Haidt did last fall, wrote something about, is social media making us terrible people? He's asking the idea of why is it that people who can get along with each other in the grocery store, can get along with each other in the park, can get along with each other in the neighborhood, go on social media and begin pulling out firearms and shooting at each other like we're just total enemies. He begins thinking about things like the composition of our brains and interrelatedness with other people relative to emotional maturity, all of these factors. Simply asking the question, have we positioned ourselves in a context to bring out the absolute worst in other people and to bring out the worst in ourselves? I think he is right. Any of you sitting in a ministry context right now know that it sometimes feels like our churches are trained to disagree. That we have sometimes not enough spiritual maturity to have unity when division would be easier, and we may not even have enough emotional maturity to sit down and have a reasonable, tolerant, listening conversation with somebody else. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we have for ministry in 2020. Think about where we are. We have fundamental disagreements in this country about things as simple as whether or not you should wear a mask. We can imagine as we move to even larger topics. What do we think about the case of a group like Black Lives Matter? Or what do we hear about when people have a view of sexuality that might be different than our own? How do we go about congregational issues where some people want to move in one direction and other people want to cling to another? It's so easy in those moments to assume the worst in those who disagree with us. If somebody believes in a little bit more taxation than we do, we call them a socialist. And if they believe in a little less than we do, we call them a heartless conservative. If somebody in church has a view of Scripture that might just lean a little bit to the left of ours, we call them a liberal. And if it's a little bit right of where we are, we demonize them and say that they're a fundamentalist. We have become conditioned to assume the worst. And God calls us to inspect ourselves, to see the plank in our own eye so that we can see clearly, to remove the speck from our brother's eye. One of my favorite New Testament scholars is Krister Stendahl, a Swedish theologian, taught at Harvard for many years. And Stendahl lays out a proposal for 3 things that we can do to have better conversations with people who are religiously different from us. Okay, these are really good. Here you go. Number 1, if you want to understand another point of view, ask people who actually believe it. Ask the members of that religion. Don't ask its enemies. So often it's easy to characterize a certain group by what we've heard people like us say about that group. That's a horrible way to learn about another group. If you want to learn about another group, ask the people who believe it. Ask the adherents. If you want to know about another social group, talk to people among that group. Listen to them. If you want to know people who have a particular point of view, get curious, find out. Don't get in the echo chamber of listening to what people like you think about people who aren't like you. You don't learn anything, and it doesn't help for any sort of reconciliation. Second thing that Stendahl says, don't compare your best to their worst. I know, this is so easy. It's easy in politics to look at the worst policies of the other group and to look at the best policies of your group, but that's not going to get us very far. It's very easy in religious conversations to look at a particular denomination or a particular world religion and say, I could never be a part of that group. Look at how ridiculous this particular teaching is or this particular doctrine is. Well, you know what the truth is? Their people might not be real head over heels over that one either. But I bet the people in that group have a few teachings and a few doctrines that they think are pretty phenomenal and they would like for you to hear about. So, don't compare our best to their worst. Compare best to best. Finally, if you want to have a conversation with somebody at a different worldview, different religion, different faith background, leave room for holy envy. Be real. Are there people in your life who are fundamentally different that have something that you are really jealous of? They might. I have people in my life who are not as religious than me, but have an incredible sense of calmness and peace. I know people in my life who don't share the same politics as me, but are more personally generous than I am. I know people in my life who don't share all the same values, but spend more time with their extended family, are more likely to get to know their neighbors, and are even more considerate of strangers in the grocery store and in the bank. What are the points of envy, a good kind of envy, that you have for people who may not see the world the same way you see it? Focus on those. It might give you a better place to have a conversation than focusing on points of difference. That's all we have for today. Think about a few of these things. You can share them in your congregations. think about Jonathan Haidt's 6 values or Krister Stendahl's 3 principles. Hope you all have a great day. Stay safe. Wear a mask. We'll see you later.